February 11th, 1951. According to multiple sources from Harlem's underworld, a package arrived at the Ravenite Social Club in Little Italy that morning. The club served as headquarters for the Gambino crime family. The package was addressed to Albert Anastasia, one of the most feared mob bosses in New York history. Known as the Lord High Executioner, Anastasia had personally killed dozens of people and ordered hundreds more deaths. Police records confirm Anastasia was at the Ravenite that morning, meeting with his capos about expanding operations into Harlem. FBI surveillance logs, declassified in 1992, note that a delivery was made to the club at approximately 10:15 a.m. What happened next exists in several versions, depending on who tells the story. The most consistent account, repeated by former Gambino associates in interviews conducted decades later, goes like this. Anastasia received the package while surrounded by his men. It was wrapped in brown paper, no return address, just his name written in neat handwriting. One of his lieutenants reportedly suggested checking it for bombs. According to a 1978 interview with former Gambino soldier Joseph Valachi, Anastasia waved off the concern. "I know who sent this," Anastasia allegedly said, though Valachi's account has been disputed by other sources. Contemporary newspaper reports from 1951 make no mention of this incident. FBI files contain only fragmentary references. Most of what we know comes from oral histories collected years later, after both Anastasia and Bumpy Johnson were dead. But the story persists in Harlem. And certain documented facts suggest something significant happened that day. To understand why a package mattered, you need to understand the context of early 1951. The Italian Mafia had been trying to expand into Harlem's narcotics trade for years. Heroin was becoming enormously profitable. The demand was exploding, and Harlem represented the largest market in New York. Bumpy Johnson controlled most of the distribution networks in Harlem. He'd built relationships with suppliers, established street-level operations, and maintained strict territorial control. The Italian families, particularly the Gambinos and Genovese, wanted in. Court records from narcotics cases in 1950-1951 show increasing conflict over Harlem territory. Several bodies turned up, though investigations went nowhere. Witnesses refused to talk. Evidence disappeared. Albert Anastasia decided to resolve the situation directly. According to FBI informant reports from early 1951, Anastasia sent word to Bumpy Johnson through intermediaries. The message, as summarized in bureau files, Anastasia wanted a meeting to discuss territorial arrangements in Harlem. What we know from multiple sources, Bumpy refused the meeting. A second message was sent. This one, according to witnesses interviewed in the 1970s, was more direct. Either Bumpy came to the table, or the Gambino family would take what they wanted by force. Former NYPD detective Raymond Jones, who worked Harlem in the 1950s, gave an interview in 1982 where he mentioned this period. There was tension between the Italians and Bumpy's operation. Everyone on the street could feel it. We expected violence, expected bodies. But it never came. Something happened that diffused it, but nobody would say what. The Amsterdam News, Harlem's primary newspaper, ran a brief item on February 8, 1951, 3 days before the package allegedly arrived. The article mentioned increased Italian presence in Harlem and noted that community leaders were concerned about outside interests disrupting local businesses. The article didn't name Bumpy Johnson, but longtime Harlem residents understood the subtext. What happened between February 8th and February 11th remains unclear. What we know from later accounts, Bumpy sent a warning to Anastasia. The exact content varies by source. Some say it was verbal, delivered through a messenger. Others claim it was written. All versions agree on the substance. Stay out of Harlem. This is your only warning. Joseph Valachi, in his 1963 testimony before the Senate, briefly mentioned this period. When asked about Gambino family operations in Harlem, he said, "Albert wanted to move in, but something happened, he backed off. I don't know all the details, wasn't my level, but I heard he got a message that changed his mind." Prosecutors pressed him. What kind of message? Valachi reportedly said, "The kind you don't ignore." That's where the gift box enters the story. Multiple Harlem sources, interviewed independently over several decades, tell similar versions. Bumpy sent a package to Anastasia. Inside was something that made the mob boss reconsider his expansion plans. What was in the box? Accounts differ significantly. One version, repeated in several books about organized crime, claims the box contained a dead canary, a traditional mob symbol for an informant. The implication, Bumpy had information that could destroy Anastasia. Another version suggests the box contained photographs. Of what, sources disagree. Some say photos of Anastasia's family, his wife, his children, at their homes, their schools. A demonstration that Bumpy could reach them any time. Others claim the photos showed Anastasia meeting with someone he shouldn't have been meeting with, evidence of betrayal or compromise. A third version, less common but mentioned in at least 2 separate oral histories, claims the box contained a piece of evidence from an old murder, something that could tie Anastasia to a killing the authorities had never solved. We have no way to verify which, if any, of these versions is accurate. What we can verify, something changed Anastasia's approach to Harlem. FBI surveillance reports from late February 1951 note that Gambino family activity in Harlem decreased significantly. Court records show fewer narcotics arrests involving Italian operators in that neighborhood. The territorial conflict that had been building simply stopped. The Ravenite incident, whatever actually occurred, became part of Harlem folklore. In 1969, a researcher named Marcus Hayes interviewed former numbers runners in Harlem for a sociology project. One interview, archived at the Schomburg Center for Research in Black Culture, includes this exchange. Hayes: "How did Bumpy Johnson maintain control when the Italian families were so powerful?" Runner, name redacted: "Bumpy understood leverage. He didn't fight them head-on. He made them understand that coming into Harlem would cost more than it was worth." Hayes: "How did he make them understand that?" Runner: "Different ways. Sometimes money, sometimes information. I heard once he sent something to one of the big bosses, something that made the guy go pale, made him back off completely." Hayes: "What did he send?" Runner: "Nobody knows for sure, but whatever it was, it worked. That boss never touched Harlem again." Albert Anastasia was murdered in 1957, shot while getting a haircut at the Park Sheraton Hotel. The killing was orchestrated by rival mob factions and had nothing to do with Bumpy Johnson or Harlem. But in the 6 years between the alleged package incident and his death, Anastasia never made another serious attempt to take over Harlem's drug trade. Some historians argue this proves nothing. Anastasia had other territories, other priorities. Perhaps Harlem simply wasn't worth the trouble. Others point to the pattern. Multiple mob bosses tried to muscle into Harlem over the years. Most backed off after confrontations with Bumpy. The methods varied, but the result was consistent. Harlem remained largely independent. In 1985, journalist Pete Hamill wrote a retrospective on Bumpy Johnson for New York Magazine. In it, he included this passage: "Old-timers in Harlem still talk about the time Bumpy sent something to a mob boss who was threatening to invade. Nobody alive can say with certainty what was in that package. But they all agree on what happened after. The mob boss backed down. In the world Bumpy inhabited, that kind of result mattered more than the details of how it was achieved." The Amsterdam News, in Bumpy's 1968 obituary, noted, "Johnson maintained control of Harlem through a combination of street intelligence, political connections, and an understanding of leverage that often prevented violence rather than provoked it." No mention of packages, no mention of Anastasia. Just the acknowledgement that Bumpy's power came from more than physical force. In 2003, a former FBI agent named Thomas Mitchell published his memoirs. He'd worked organized crime cases in New York during the 1950s and 60s. In the book, he included this paragraph. "We always wondered how Bumpy Johnson kept the Italians out of Harlem for so long. We assumed it was violence, constant low-level warfare that made the territory too expensive to take. But informants suggested something different. They said Bumpy had files, information on everyone, cops, judges, mobsters, politicians. He knew secrets that could destroy careers and lives, and he wasn't afraid to let people know he had that information. Whether he ever used it, I can't say, but the threat was enough." What was in the box Albert Anastasia allegedly received on February 11, 1951? We don't know. We may never know. But we know that after that day, according to multiple independent sources, Anastasia stopped pushing into Harlem. We know that the territorial conflict that had been building suddenly de-escalated. We know that Bumpy Johnson continued controlling Harlem's underworld for another 17 years without serious Italian interference. In 1972, a documentary filmmaker interviewed former Anastasia associate Ralph Salerno. The interview was never broadcast, but the transcript exists in the filmmaker's archived papers. Filmmaker: "Did Anastasia ever talk about Bumpy Johnson?" Salerno: "Once, just once. Someone asked him why we weren't pushing harder into Harlem. There was money there, lots of money." Filmmaker: "What did he say?" Salerno: "He said, that pauses. That guy knows things that could hurt us. It's not worth it. That's all he said. Never brought it up again." Filmmaker: "What things?" Salerno: "He never said. But Albert wasn't a man who scared easy. Whatever Bumpy had, it was serious." The story of the gift box has been repeated, embellished and mythologized for decades. Each telling adds new details, removes others, shifts emphasis. But stripped of the mythology, here's what the available evidence suggests. In early 1951, Albert Anastasia attempted to expand Gambino operations into Harlem. Bumpy Johnson resisted. Some form of communication occurred, possibly a package, possibly just a message, that convinced Anastasia to back off. The exact nature of that communication remains unknown, but it involved leverage significant enough to deter one of the most violent mob bosses in American history. Whether it was photographs, documents, evidence of crimes, or something else entirely, we cannot say with certainty. What we can say, it worked. And for researchers trying to understand how Bumpy Johnson maintained power for 3 decades in the most competitive criminal environment in America, that's the important part. Not the dramatic details, not the mythology, the pattern. Bumpy didn't always win through violence. Often he won through information, through understanding what people feared losing, through making the cost of conflict higher than the potential gain. The gift box story, whatever truth it contains, represents that strategy perfectly. A message delivered, a threat implied, a decision changed, no shots fired, no bodies dropped, no war, just power, exercised quietly. February 11th, 1951, a package allegedly arrived at the Ravenite Social Club. Albert Anastasia, one of the most feared men in organized crime, allegedly opened it. And according to multiple sources speaking years later, whatever he saw inside changed his plans for Harlem. The details remain disputed. The outcome is documented. Sometimes the most effective power is the kind nobody can fully verify. If this approach feels more authentic, more grounded in actual historical methodology, hit subscribe. We're reconstructing stories from fragmented evidence, oral histories, and declassified files. The truth isn't always clear, but the patterns are undeniable. Drop a like if you appreciate the difference between mythology and documentation. And in the comments, do you think the gift box story is real, or is it legend built on a grain of truth? More evidence-based stories coming soon. The documented moments that hint at larger truths.